May 1940, somewhere along the Belgian frontier. A German infantryman sat against the cold steel of a panzer hull, legs aching, eyes raw from 2 days without sleep. Around him, the night was not quiet. Engines growled in the dark. Officers moved between vehicles with low voices and urgent gestures. A medic crouched beside him and pressed a small tin into his palm. Inside were tablets, white, unremarkable, the size of an aspirin. He swallowed one without water. Within the hour, something shifted. The exhaustion did not disappear, it retreated. Pushed back behind a wall of strange electric clarity, his thoughts sharpened. The fear was still there, still real, but distant, like a sound heard through thick glass. He did not know what was in the tablet. Few of them did. What he held in his hand was Pervitin, a drug synthesized less than a decade earlier in a Berlin laboratory, distributed by the millions of doses across the German Army, Air Force and Navy. A drug that military planners believed could compress the limits of human endurance, that could turn ordinary men into soldiers who did not need sleep, did not feel pain, did not hesitate. And for a time, a brief, extraordinary and deeply dangerous time, they were right. The story did not begin on a battlefield. It began in a Tokyo laboratory in 1893, when Japanese chemist Nagayoshi Nagai first synthesized a compound from the ephedrine plant. He called it methamphetamine. At the time, it was little more than a chemical curiosity, filed away, largely forgotten. Decades passed. Then, in 1937, a pharmacologist named Fritz Hauschild was working for the Temmler Pharmaceutical Company in Berlin. He had been studying benzodrine, an American stimulant already attracting attention for suppressing fatigue. He wanted something better, something German, something that could be manufactured domestically at scale. Using earlier synthesis methods as a foundation, Hauschild developed a new formulation. Temmler patented it and branded it under a name that would become infamous: Pervitin. Chemically, Pervitin triggered massive releases of dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, the brain's primary alertness chemicals, far beyond what normal neural activity would ever produce. Effects began within 30 minutes. Users felt alert, confident, physically capable. Appetite disappeared. The need for sleep retreated. Pain thresholds rose. Temmler introduced Pervitin commercially in 1938 with no prescription required. Berliners called it the pep pill. Housewives took it with coffee. A Berlin confectioner even produced Pervitin-laced chocolates, sold openly in gift boxes. But within certain offices of the German military establishment, something far more serious was being discussed. A military physician named Otto Friedrich Ranke had been testing Pervitin on university students in late 1939. His findings were striking. Subjects performed better, stayed awake far longer, and reported sustained determination well past the point where control groups had collapsed. In January 1940, Ranke sent his findings to Military Medical Command with an unambiguous recommendation. Germany should use this compound on its soldiers. The timing could not have been more consequential. The plan had been building for months. By early 1940, German military leadership was finalizing an offensive that would shock the world. An armoured thrust through the Ardennes forest, bypassing the Maginot Line, driving toward the English Channel at a pace that had never been attempted in modern warfare. It required continuous movement, day and night, with minimal rest, for 3 days or more without meaningful sleep. Human bodies could not do that, not without help. Between April and July of 1940, approximately 35 million Pervitin tablets were ordered by Army and Air Force Command, packaged in small tins, issued to soldiers and pilots as part of standard medical kits. The results were, by contemporary accounts, remarkable. Panzer crews operating tanks through the night stayed sharp. Pilots maintained concentration through sorties that should have left them incapacitated. Infantry soldiers who had marched through the previous night swallowed tablets at dawn and kept moving. Letters home from soldiers during the French campaign carried fragments of this experience. One infantryman wrote to his father that he had marched for 3 days nearly without rest and felt, as he put it, invincible. Another described a state of almost supernatural clarity. Decisions came without hesitation. The usual fog of fear replaced by something clean and purposeful. France fell in 46 days. The speed of the German advance stunned Allied commanders, stunned European governments, stunned the world. Beneath it all, running through the bloodstream of an army moving faster than any had moved before, was a chemical that no one on the Allied side fully understood. Success obscures problems. This is one of the oldest and most dangerous dynamics in military history. While German commanders celebrated the fall of France, a quieter set of observations was accumulating in field medical reports. Soldiers who had taken Pervitin heavily during the campaign were not recovering normally. The crash was worse than expected. Men slept for 16, 18, 20 hours straight, then woke feeling hollow, irritable, disconnected. Their hands shook. Their appetites, suppressed during the campaign, came back with a ferocity that left them eating compulsively and still unsatisfied. In more serious cases, the psychological deterioration was alarming. Men who had taken large doses over several days reported paranoia, a persistent sense of threat that bore no relation to actual danger. Some experienced sounds that were not there. A few reported seeing things. Field surgeons noted an unusual number of cardiac irregularities among soldiers, with no prior history of heart problems. The drug elevated heart rate and blood pressure substantially. In healthy young men during brief use, this was tolerable. In soldiers who had been taking it repeatedly over days of extreme physical exertion, the strain was beginning to kill. And then there was the question of dependence. Some soldiers had begun taking Pervitin not because orders demanded it, but because without it, the world felt grey and slow in a way it had not before. They were taking it during off hours between assignments, not for performance, but for the sensation of normality that had become chemically redefined. Leo Conti, the Reich health leader, had been watching the civilian spread of Pervitin since 1938 with growing alarm. In 1941, he successfully petitioned to have it classified as a controlled substance under German narcotics law. But in the military, Pervitin was already embedded in operational culture. The French campaign had worked. The institutional inertia was enormous. The problems were real. They were documented. They were beginning to be impossible to ignore. And yet, the army could not simply stop. The Eastern Front changed everything. Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22nd, 1941. 3 million troops, a front stretching nearly 3,000 kilometres, terrain that was vast, hostile, and nothing like France. The Soviet Union did not collapse. The war in the East became grinding and attritional, and in that context, Pervitin transformed from an emergency stimulant used during a rapid campaign into something soldiers were taking continuously, chronically, in quantities far beyond anything the Temler Company had intended. Field reports from 1941 and 1942 described soldiers rationing their last tablets with the same calculation they applied to ammunition. When the tablets ran out, units descended into states of total incapacitation. Men unable to function, shaking, emotionally volatile, useless as fighting soldiers for days at a time. The crash was no longer an inconvenience. It was a tactical liability. Officers filed reports describing soldiers who had become erratic, prone to poor judgment, sudden outbursts, irrational fear responses disconnected from any actual threat. Men who had been reliable before the Eastern Front had become, after months of heavy use, fundamentally unreliable. Not cowards, not malingerers, chemically altered, in ways that could not be reversed simply by removing the drug. Young men in their 20s, with no prior cardiac history, were found dead in their sleeping positions, showing signs consistent with acute heart failure. By 1942, military medical command was receiving increasingly urgent internal communications. Some advocated for sharply restricted access. Others argued restriction was impossible. that soldiers would obtain the drug through informal channels regardless, or that removing it would damage combat effectiveness more than the side effects already had. Both arguments had merit. Neither offered a solution. In the winter of 1944, a German submarine physician named Gerhard Orzechowski sat down to write a report that no one in the Naval High Command wanted to read. Orzechowski had been studying the effects of Pervitin on U-boat crews. Men operating in conditions of sustained psychological pressure, confined space, irregular sleep, and constant proximity to mortal danger. Crews were maintaining themselves on Pervitin through multi-week patrols, and they were arriving back at port in states of deterioration that went well beyond normal operational fatigue. His report was meticulous. Dependency, cardiovascular abnormalities, psychological disturbance. He used a word that the German military had been carefully avoiding: addiction. Not side effects, not operational stress. Addiction, in the precise clinical sense. Around the same time, German researchers attempted to develop a replacement, a compound called DX, a cocaine methamphetamine opioid cocktail, experimentally tested at a concentration camp in late 1944. The subjects were prisoners, forced to march with heavy packs while researchers measured how far they could walk before collapsing. DIX never reached operational distribution. The war ended before it could be scaled, but its development illustrated where the logic of Pervitin had led, from stimulant tablets issued to soldiers to experimental cocktails tested on prisoners. That arc said something damning, not just about one drug, about the entire logic of chemically augmented warfare. The story of Pervitin has attracted, in the decades since the war, myths in both directions. Both distort what actually happened. The first myth, that Pervitin turned German soldiers into superhuman fighters, that it explains the Blitzkrieg, that it was the secret weapon behind Germany's early victories. This does not survive careful examination. Pervitin helped soldiers stay awake. It suppressed fatigue. In specific operational contexts, particularly France, where speed was the decisive factor, those effects had genuine tactical value, but it did not make soldiers better marksmen. It did not improve tactical judgment in any sustained or reliable way, and over extended use, it actively degraded the qualities that made soldiers effective. Paranoia impairs judgment. And quote, cardiovascular strain reduces capability. Dependency creates liability. Germany's early victories had many causes. Pervitin was one thread in a complex picture, not the explanation. The second myth, that Pervitin was a uniquely German experiment, a pharmacological horror with no parallel elsewhere. This is also false. British soldiers received benzodrine through standard military supply. American forces used it extensively in air operations. Churchill's personal physician was among those who recommended it to British command. Japanese forces used methamphetamine on a scale that may have exceeded German consumption, producing a post-war dependency crisis that devastated Japanese civilian society for a generation. The United States continued supplying amphetamines to its armed forces through Korea, through Vietnam. Today, modafinil has replaced amphetamine as the preferred military stimulant, but the underlying logic is identical. The impulse behind Pervitin, the chemically extending the limits of soldiers at war, was not uniquely German. It was universal. It has not gone away. The war ended. The tablets stopped coming. For men who had been taking Pervitin through years of frontline service, the end of supply was not a clean break. It was a crisis that arrived at the same moment as the general collapse. Many veterans did not recognize their dependency for what it was. The clinical frameworks that would eventually develop around methamphetamine addiction were decades away. Men who felt hollow, unable to sleep, prone to inexplicable rage, they understood those states as wounds of the war itself. They were not entirely wrong, but Pervitin had wounded them too in ways they would never have a name for. Military supply records suggest somewhere in the range of 200 million Pervitin tablets were produced and distributed to German armed forces between 1939 and 1945, almost certainly an undercount. That number suggests something that went far beyond a targeted supplement for specific operations. Pervitin had become the chemical infrastructure of an army. The Temmler Company survived the war. Pervitin remained available by medical prescription in West Germany until 1988. What the story of Pervitin offers, looked at clearly, is not a story of German evil or Allied innocence. It is a story about what happens when institutions decide that the needs of an operation outweigh the needs of the people conducting it. When the human body is understood as a problem to be solved, rather than a limit to be respected. The soldiers who took those white tablets in the spring of 1940 did not know what they were swallowing. They had not been asked. They trusted the medics, the tins, the official distribution channels. Most of them never stopped paying for it.